This cold is still hanging on after 4 weeks. It's insane. Anyhow, it is May the 4th, and that, of course, is the anniversary of the 1970 murder of 4 young people by the National Guard in Ohio. Crosby, Stills, Young, and Nash singing about this. Here we go. Remember that? 4 dead in Ohio. Yeah, it's. I don't want to play too much of it here. We'll end up having to pay royalties, but it's. Could this happen again? I mean, have we reached the point now where we're as polarized as we were in 1970? In 1970, you had like Governor Ronald Reagan, coming out and saying that he's going to do away with free public education in California because those brats are out there protesting the war. Remember that? And that kind of set the tone for the nation of, hey, it's okay to kill those brats. Let's just take them down. Could we be facing that kind of thing in a Trump administration? Or would he simply do like Hitler did and allow his volunteer forces, the brown shirts, who were not affiliated with the government, they were volunteers, sort of Hitler's version of the Tea Party, to do the killing and the butt kicking and whatnot? Number one. Number two, Rudy Giuliani. Let me combine a couple of things together here. Rudy Giuliani just got thrown under the bus by Trump. Trump says, oh, Rudy doesn't have his facts straight. Don't worry, he'll get it all straight. In other words, we tried this trial balloon. Heather Digby Parton over at Raw Story writes, and this is just absolutely brilliant. She is just so good. She writes, evidently Giuliani and Trump cooked this strategy up all by themselves. This whole do the media thing and blame it all on Michael Cohen. Bringing to mind one of those movies where the aging crooks sit in the diner and plan their last big heist, which, naturally enough, goes terribly wrong because their skills aren't as sharp as they used to be. She adds, you'll recall that at one time it was assumed that Giuliani would be in the cabinet, perhaps as Attorney General. But gossip at the time held that Trump noticed that Giuliani was dozing off in meetings and didn't think Giuliani was smart enough for a big job, sharp enough for a big job. So he put him in charge of some cybersecurity program, which Giuliani promised to get right as soon as he figured out how to set the clock on his brand new VCR, and that was the last we heard about it. I love it. But it raises a much larger question, that and this fascinating piece by David K. Johnson in Salon today, is Trump a broke billionaire? Now, I went back yesterday and a couple of days ago and shared with you the story from that Donald Trump, from the guy who was the reporter for Forbes magazine at the time, and his responsibility was putting together, or excuse me, not Forbes, it was Fortune, putting together the Fortune 400, the list of the Fortune 400. And in the very first 3 years, this guy was in charge of it, or maybe the first 4 years. And every year, Donald Trump called him up, pretending to be John Barron. And he has, the Washington Post has the recordings of the calls. Donald Trump called him up and said, Donald Trump, pretending not to be Donald Trump, said, Donald Trump is worth billions, billions. And so in the first year, he said, well, okay, he's not worth billions, but we'll list him at 200 million. It turned out, and they found this 3 years later, or 4 years later, they found out that he was actually only worth $5 million. So right from the get-go, the Forbes list was a lie, based on lies that Donald Trump fed the media. This guy, lying is part of his business strategy. It's part of his personal strategy. It is at the core of Donald Trump's life. He is a pathological liar. He surrounds himself with people who are either willing to facilitate or enable those lies. Rudy Giuliani, the latest in the crew, although Giuliani seems to share many of the personality characteristics that Donald Trump has, including the multiple wives. So David K. Johnston is now coming out and saying, not only was he only worth $5 million back then, that was before his bankruptcies. He's destroyed his businesses. And he points out that in 1990, now the Forbes thing was in the 1980s, in 1990, Trump was trying to get a license to run a casino. And he had to submit actual, real financial data to the Nevada Gaming Commission. And they concluded, based on actually looking at his books in 1990, that he had a negative net worth of $295 million. In other words, he not only was not worth anything at all, he was almost $300 million in debt. And then Giuliani, David K. Johnston points out, kind of revived this question of, is it possible that Trump is not only not a billionaire, never was a billionaire, always was lying to Forbes magazine, this is why he won't release his tax returns, but is it possible that he's also right now broke? That he is he's more in debt than he has assets to cover it? And Johnston gives a couple of examples of this. By the way, I'd add, it's Anything Goes Friday, so, you know, I'm laying out some topics here, but, you know, feel free to talk, you can call on anything you want. And the point that Johnston makes is that, you know, what self-respecting billionaire or even, you know, multi-millionaire would have to stretch a $130,000 hooker payment, or not, porn star payment, would have to stretch that out over a 4-month period, which is what Trump had to do. He had to pay it at $35,000 a month. He wasn't trying to avoid reporting requirements. That only has to do with cash. And that's anything over $10,000. So it had nothing to do with that. It's like, why did he have to pay it out over a 4-month period? Because he's broke. He ran for president because he was broke. He wanted to raise his profile so more countries and more companies would want to put his name on their buildings, which is the principal way that he makes income these days. Which raises a larger question, which is, at what point does all this house of cards that Donald Trump has been so carefully building since the 1970s, at what point does this house of cards collapse around him? At what point does Robert Mueller come out and tell the American people something so horrific? You know, your president is basically a mob boss. That even the Republicans in the House of Representatives say, you know, we'll sign on for an impeachment. Just like Republicans did in 1973-74 with Richard Nixon. And at that point, if Trump leaves office, and I personally think that the way that something like that would play out is that Trump would resign. I don't, you know, just like Nixon did. And he would do it with an assurance from Mike Pence that he will be pardoned, just like Jerry Ford pardoned Richard Nixon. And then he can go back to being a grifter in New York City. But here's the thing. The reason why I think that pardon is so important to him is because the only way that he can prevent damage to himself and his family, and now we know that his son-in-law is as big a grifter as he is, and his daughter is as big a grifter as he is, and his sons are obviously grifters. The only way that he can keep the grift going is to remain in the White House. He has the power to block examinations of him. He has the power to threaten politicians. He'll no longer be able to threaten politicians if he resigns. He'll no longer be able to threaten prosecutors or fire them if he resigns. He'll no longer have, you know, Fox News will no longer have his back if he resigns. So will he turn the guns of America, the American police forces, on his opponents? Will he start imprisoning people? I mean, are we going to go down the road of Erdogan in Turkey? You know, one of Trump's role models? Or Orban in Hungary, or Duterte in the Philippines? Or is it going to be something even more bizarre? What do you think?